My name is Jeff Rojas. I'm a fashion and portrait photographer based in New York City, and I've been shooting for the last 6 years. I picked up my first camera about 6 years ago. My first camera was a Canon Rebel XSI, and fashion photography wasn't something that I endeavored into. It wasn't something that I had planned on doing. I fell into it. When I picked up my first camera, eventually going from the automotive world into photographing models, into photographing people, I enjoyed what I did so much, I decided to make it my career. I lost my full-time job. I had just gotten laid off. I decided to take this opportunity to turn a hobby into a legitimate career. And it's been a whirlwind ever since, but it's been a lot of fun. When I started photography, I realized quickly that there wasn't really much information on photographing men whatsoever. There was one book on the market, and that book wasn't something I loved. To be blatantly honest, it was terrible. I mean, most of the poses that were in there were 500 poses for men. Some of them were karate poses, some of them were just poses that weren't refined. Now, when you look at a cover like GQ or you look at something like Esquire, there's a sense of refinity to those specific publications. And that wasn't something that was happening in the photography industry. As I wanted to be photographed and comparing myself to photos, there was great advertising commercial imagery, but there wasn't tutorials on how to make that happen. And that's something I wanted to change. I realized that being on camera isn't something that's native to everybody. Not everyone's comfortable being in the hot seat, and I don't expect anybody to feel that. My goal when I photograph anyone on set is to make them feel comfortable and confident. So oftentimes you'll see that I shoot less and talk more, because I realize how important conversation is when I'm discussing photography with people, or how they should pose, or how they should look in a specific shot. And communication's key. Communication's key to everything that we do. And I think a lot of photographers forget that. One of the things that I do is spend more time speaking with the subject and less time on the production aspect of things. I use less lights just so I can give my client the attention that they deserve. I also put down my camera a lot. I realize how important that sales tactic is. Being able to put down that camera and have a conversation, realizing this is a thing of fear. I'm gonna go ahead and take this. Once I feel that I have enough rapport built with my client, I'll pick that camera back up and take that photograph. Because I know at that point they have some sense of confidence in themselves and they trust me at that given point. If you're a portrait photographer, you're a business person. You have to realize that you're in charge of sales, marketing, accounting, everything. If you're a solopreneur or a solo entrepreneur, you're literally in charge of everything. Minimizing your amount of work on set is one of the biggest skill sets that you can have. Minimizing the amount of gear that you bring to the table, minimizing the complexity of everything you do is the way that you set yourself up for success. When you look at the greats, when you look at great photographers, and when I'm talking about the top 5, 10 in history, you look at them and you say, how have they been so successful? And that's simply because they have a ton of support. They have the team to make that happen. They have people worrying about hair. They have people worrying about makeup. They have people worrying about this and that, and they can focus on getting that image. You as a solopreneur, somebody who's by themselves behind a camera, don't have the same flexibility. You don't have the same support network. So minimizing the amount of things that you have to think on set that's not working with your client is so vastly important. And realizing and contextualizing what you're trying to get out of that image, which a lot of times is just taking an image of the best form of your client. When I'm organizing a shoot, a lot of it has to do with communication, right? I think a lot of photographers have that breakdown in communication on what they need and what they're expecting. When I send an email out to a client, oftentimes it'll list exactly what I'm looking for attire. It'll list more or less what the look's going to look like. If it's a professional shoot, I send out a mood board so everybody's on the same page. I make sure that there's enough communication to show what the final image is going to look like. If I don't have those same steps, there's a lot of miscommunication, lots of misdirection on set. It makes my job a lot more difficult. So communication is the most key aspect of being able to walk away with great imagery. Investing in your client's brand is the quickest way to see a return on your investment in time, and it ultimately impacts the way that you approach photographing a specific client. So here's why. When I'm looking at photographing, let's say a professional, a doctor, a lawyer, I realize that my images affect their income. It has a direct impact on the way that they're looking for clients. So here's an example. You photograph a doctor, they don't look as best as possible in that specific image. Their potential clients see that image and don't hire them based off of that image. That's affecting their personal brand. And photographers don't realize how much weight they have when they're trying to photograph somebody and the impact that they can have on somebody's income. If you're photographing somebody for, let's say, a dating app, photographing them and making them look their best can impact the way that they're being perceived by their potential mates. Our images have so much weight when it comes to personal brand, most photographers don't even understand the beginning of that value. Photographing the average Joe is a special project for me in that I'm taking information that I learned while writing Photographing Men, while teaching Photographing Men on Creative Live, and compacting that information into a digestible format, something that's simple, short, sweet, and to the point. I'm going to show you guys the lighting techniques that I use, the posing techniques that I use, the editing techniques that I use to simplify the process of photographing every man. For this specific project, I'm not using any models. I use models for Photographing Men on both the visual media platform on Creative Live, as well as the written platform that I have with the book. Everyone that I'm photographing today is going to be a normal person, regardless of how good looking you think they are. They're my assistants, they're my friends, they're students of mine. These are real people. These are people that you would find on the street in your everyday life. So if I can photograph these people to look and feel their best, then you can do the same. I think one of the things photographers generally suck at is identifying when their client has a perceived flaw, regardless if it's blatant. So here's an example. Your client comes on set, they're wearing a hat, they don't feel secure about their hairline, they continue wearing a hat, you ask them to take the hat off, they inevitably say, please don't use a rim light on my hair as a joke. They'll say something stupid to identify that. Don't make this look more shiny than it needs to be. And most photographers just laugh that off, when that should be something you should have consideration for in lighting and in the context of what's happening there. That person's alluding to the fact that they have a defined view of themselves. They have a warped perspective on what they think is beautiful, and ultimately something about themselves that they have as a personal flaw. What do you like about yourself physically on your face? What's your favorite part?
My eyes.
Okay. What else? Give me three things. Three of your favorite things.
My eyes. That's all.
Your eyes? Nothing else? Nothing else matters?
My
okay.
eyes. My nose is a little crooked, my teeth a little bit crooked. I say eyes, lips, and...
If it makes you feel any better, I didn't notice anything with your nose whatsoever or your teeth.
Okay.
Okay, that's the first thing. I think we inevitably all have something that we feel is wrong with us and no one else sees. And that kind of says something about people in general. Like, we all have like this warped perspective of ourselves. You have great eyes, and I know that from looking at you. I didn't notice anything aside from that.
Thank you.
Is there anything that you're self-conscious of aside from those two things?
Yeah, up top.
Up top. What is it about up top that bothers you?
Receding hairline.
Okay.
The corners.
Okay. So my job is to then make you look better on set. So I'm going to do my best to make sure that every image that I take of you gets to that point. Okay, so as I'm building up to those lighting setups, everything that I'm going to do is to help you feel confident about yourself. Okay, so I'm going to build up lighting that will complement those features that you love and detract away from things that aren't going to make you look or feel as great. Okay, so we're going to do all the posing, all the lighting, the same thing that we did everything else. So I make sure that I never bring up flaws on set, or what I define as perceived flaws. Now, everyone has a different bias as what they see as beautiful, and I know that. We all see it. I mean, we all have a biological just enticement to a specific thing. Not everyone's gonna find the other person beautiful, but what I do is I try to focus on what I like about that specific person, focus on the beautiful part of that person. Say they have an amazing jawline, amazing cheekbones, I focus on those things. I don't bring up their perceived flaws or what I perceive as flaws, because maybe it's not a flaw to them. And now you're gonna bring up something that they're gonna be self-conscious about for the rest of their lives. Don't create insecurities for people. Make them look and feel their best. So when I discuss salesmanship, it's not just in the process of talking to a client or selling a client. It's throughout the whole process of the image making. I know when I'm trying to make somebody look their best, I'm really selling them. I'm letting them know that they look their best. I'm kind of like the person behind the scenes at your house. It's like, do I look fat? No, you look amazing. My job is to be that person. Ultimately, I want to back up the person that's on set. I want them to look and feel their best. I need to acknowledge and give them positive reinforcement for them to look and feel their best. You can't just look at somebody and say, you look fat, I can't take any more photos. And I say that jokingly, but even saying something like, I'm not happy with your midsection, what you're saying is you're fat around your midsection. Don't bring light to those things. Just say, you know what, I think this would look better if you stick your chest out, tummy in, and you can have that conversation in a very positive light. You don't have to have a conversation about negative aspects of the image making. One of the things I think I bring to the table that a lot of photographers take for granted is knowing your equipment. I know that using a wider angle lens makes my client look wider in camera. I know that using broad form of lighting makes my client look wider in camera. I know that using short light takes away from visual weight. I know everything that my gear is doing, and knowing what my gear is doing allows me to take better images of my clients. I think most people feel stupid behind a camera. I don't think it's just men. I don't think it's exclusively to men. I think everyone, when they first get in front of a camera, unless they're narcissistic, most people don't like being behind the lens. And that's okay. That my job is to break that down, make them look and feel comfortable on camera. So because I realize how weird this conversation of being in front of the camera, a lot of times I will do things so they feel comfortable. No one likes to be in front of that camera. No one likes to have the spotlight on them. It is a very uncomfortable thing. It is not a natural thing to have all the spectatorship at you. So again, my job is to make them look and feel their best and take away from that mindset so they don't feel as stupid. I think on a professional capacity, a lot of photographers men think photography is a waste of time. And I argue this all the time. So one of the things I learned, or I heard rather, when I first started photography was that men don't care. Men don't care about photography. The groom doesn't care about being there. Sell the bride, she'll sell the groom. Let the bride sell the groom, that's not your responsibility. He does not matter. Men out there, how many times have you looked at an old photograph of yourself 5-10 years ago and said, I look skinnier in that photograph, I wish I would have looked like that, or I remember this, or felt nostalgic? You really do care about what you look in those images. It may not seem like you're involved in the process, but you care about the final result. So my job is to make sure that you're vested into the process, so that way when you're looking at the final result, my job matters. When I look at wedding photography, oftentimes I realize the bride is the forefront of the whole wedding day, right? Most photographers don't put the groom in the spotlight. Who's getting married that day? There's two people, it's not just one. And photographers ultimately forget about the groom. And I'm gonna give you guys just a quick story. I met a photographer who teaches photography. Their bias is towards the bride, and rightfully so. I understand the emotional capacity of trying to sell the bride for the day and everything that's there. You're selling two people, you're not just selling one. And both parties married each other on that day. It's a union of two people on a given day. 50, 60 years from now, that groom's gonna look back at his photographs, and if he is a second part of those images, he's gonna remember those things. He's gonna remember being there that day and not having that attention geared towards them. Basic sales dictates that you find a reason why you're photographing someone and find the reason that they want to be photographed, right? You understand what their need is and you try to fill that need. If you come to a portrait session on a professional capacity, I know that as a salesperson, as a business person, I'm gonna sell you on the results of those images and what the return on investment is. If you're coming for a private portrait session, I wanna make sure why you're taking this image so I can give you that final result and show you how I'm gonna get there. I show you the steps to make that happen. So that conversation, that communication is the most important role when you're working in a professional capacity as a photographer. So there's this misinformation that goes around in the marketplace about photographing people and not letting them see the images until post. I don't agree with that whatsoever. I want my client invested into that final image. I want them to look at that image and say, I love that image. I love the next one. I love the one after that. I invest them in the process, right? It's also part of my sales. As I'm photographing somebody, I'm also rating images on camera, right? We build up to an image where they look and they feel their best. They get to see the final result of all the posing, the lighting, the direction that's happening on set. And as I'm selling them, I'm like, you look amazing in this specific image, and they acknowledge and they agree. It also helps me in the sales process. I go ahead, because I'm using a Canon, I can rate my camera and I can go ahead and make sure that I have that saved in that file saved. So when I deliver that file, there's no questions asked. From beginning to end, it's a very seamless process to how I'm selling my clients.
Perfect. Oh, wow.
I don't consider myself a extremely intelligent person. I just consider myself very aware of people. I like to understand people, and it means something to me. When I'm trying to dissect someone, what I'm really trying to see is what resonates well with them, what makes them tick, what makes them happy, what makes them angry, what makes them sad. As a strategic person, as a logical person, that allows me to make sure that my client looks and feels their best. Understanding the importance of something like body language is so important, because it's all the visual cues somebody has to what they're really feeling. They can say something, but their body communicates something different. Their body is what you need to focus on when you're trying to get the expressions of what truth is. As an image maker, you can't record voice unless you're recording video. Image is everything. Body language, therefore, and physical body language is the only way to look at an image and make that client look their best. I think a lot of photographers have been sold for years that posing is like the #1 thing you should worry about on set, and I disagree with that wholeheartedly. Here's why. Body language should happen before posing. The context and the story should happen before you pose your client. Posing, as an example, should be an afterthought to that body language. What is that person trying to convey? What is their body trying to convey? If I sat here and I looked uncomfortable and reserved, what is that going to resonate with the client, with you guys? How would you feel about the context of what we're having? After we have that conversation, then I can sit up and then I can tuck my tummy in to make myself look a little better. Those are things that I happen to think about while working on set. I want you guys to feel like your client's comfortable and that they can look and feel their best. The posing is the tweaking. The body language is what you're trying to convey to their specific audience, and that's so much more important than what pose you choose. Body language is communication. Posing happens to be making that person's physical appearance look better in camera, right? So when we look at things on set, and I'm talking about body language, really what I'm talking about is what they're trying to convey, not what their visual appearance looks like. So I start off with the body language and then work into the posing technique, just because it allows me to tweak and correct any errors that I see on set. So one of the things I'm gonna go ahead and just blatantly say, and I say this to everyone, is that posing doesn't work with everyone. I make good money selling posing guides. I sell posing guides on my site, they're in my book. They're called posing reference guides for a reason. They're poses to build off of. They're not poses to replicate. Not every client, not every pose is gonna work with every specific client. Not every, that goes with the story as well as the actual pose. If somebody doesn't have enough flexibility, it's not gonna work. If the context is, I'm photographing a lawyer and they look a little more defensive because they have their hands this way and they look a little angry, would you hire that person, right? Those are the things to think about when you're thinking about posing, what the story's telling the audience, and then you cater the posing to that specific story. I think photographers overlook the importance of body language, specifically because they've been taught for years that posing is vastly more important. And I combat that every single day. Body language communicates a message. Posing is making someone look great on camera. There's no nuances of difference. Those are the two defined parameters each part has. As a person who's a salesperson, I consider myself a salesperson before I do a creative. As a salesperson, I realize that focusing on that body language allows me to convey a message to my audience. It allows me to understand my client. It allows me to sell my client. If I'm trying to sell a specific client, I can mimic their body language in order for them to feel more comfortable. There's so many things that body language does for portrait photographers that they don't even realize. They don't realize the complexity of what body language is and the importance of making sure that happens both on set and off set. As a young person, I was a terrible salesperson. I was terrible. Like, there's no worse salesperson than I was. I worked at a car dealership at the age of 18. Yes, great job for a terrible salesperson. And my job was to work and sell cars, right? And in selling cars, if you don't make money, you don't eat. Like, there's no ifs, ands, or buts. Just like being an entrepreneur, there's no difference. I need to sell in order to make money. I barely ate, and I say that jokingly, but I made minimum wage. I pooled my money specifically because I couldn't get any clients. And I spent time really understanding how other people were doing it. Some of the older salespeople, the people who had been seasoned working for 30, 40, 50 years selling cars, had done so with such just a fluid motion. They didn't really think about it, they just did, they sold. And it wasn't like they were selling. And I realized they were doing one key thing differently. They were looking at clients as a person to build rapport with, not a person to sell. Part of that process was understanding body language and mimicking body language. If somebody happened to be a little more, just more direct and professional, they would deal with that person more direct and professional. If somebody was more laid back and had a conversation, they were willing to sit and down in their seat, they would replicate that body language. And what I realized was they were creating rapport with their clients without actually having to sell their specific clients. Once they did that, they built that extra rapport, and then they can sell their clients even better. Body language can be different depending on where you live, where you are, anywhere that you commute. For example, I know that there's certain cues in hand language that I can't use in Japanese markets because they're offensive. I'm not gonna say those right now because some of you that are watching in Japanese, and that would be extremely offensive. I say that because you should understand the culture that you're in and what specific body language means to that specific culture. Doesn't mean that you're just an American and you understand body language here. Understand who your client is, understand what they bring to the table and who the culture is that they're trying to reach. If you have, for example, a Japanese client and most of their audience, and it's a professional capacity, and most of their clients are Japanese, you don't necessarily want to use certain hand gestures that are going to offend their clients. You should know these things before you take that portrait. Even though they should know the culture, invest in your client. And this goes back to investing in your client's brand. Anyone who understands the importance of body language realizes the importance of salesmanship. When you're trying to sell that client and you're trying to sell something to an audience, you want them to look at you as a person of distinction. So here's an example. If I were photographing a lawyer and they looked uneasy in a photograph, or they look as a person that's unapproachable, would you hire that person? If they look weak, would you hire that lawyer? And most of you would say no. But some of you, when you're taking your portraits, you don't think about that when you're on set. You think so much of how to make that person look great on camera, you don't think about body language. You think about posing, you think about what the posing is going to do, but you're not thinking about what the body language itself is communicating. All of that plays a role into if their audience is going to hire them. And it impacts the way that we need to photograph those clients. It puts more value for us as photographers. I know that I can charge more when I'm investing in my client's brand that way. Body language isn't restricted to professionals. I use body language even if I'm photographing somebody in a private portrait client. So when I'm photographing anyone, I realize, here's an example. If you photograph me right now and I had my hands open, I have nothing to hide, right? We're having a discussion, I have nothing to hide, everything's on the table, and that's what resonates with you. You're more likely to trust me because I have nothing that I'm hiding. However, if I sat here this whole time and I had a conversation with you like this, and I'm reserved and defensive, would you trust me? And the truth is that you wouldn't. You wouldn't have the same connection with me as an audience. So it doesn't matter if you're photographing somebody in a professional capacity or a private capacity. Image is everything, and body language conveys the message that they're conveying without you even realizing it. No matter how much you can spout at me, no matter how much you lie to me, no matter how much whatever comes out your mouth, if your body doesn't communicate the same thing, I know you're lying. Body language is everything. You can absolutely tell body language. And here's a perfect example. Those of you that are married, think of your spouse. If you see that their body language is a little off and they just say, "I'm fine," you know that they're not fine. Private portrait sessions and professional portrait sessions are the same thing. You want to understand that conveying a message with your body is thoroughly important when you're on set. So here's the part that photographers don't realize. A smile isn't just here. A smile happens in the eyes. When I actually laugh and I inevitably, joke and say something funny, you'll see crinkles right around my eyes. If I just smile, there's no crinkles here, right? Smiling happens right here. And you can always tell a genuine smile if someone's happy depending on how those crow lines are. It's a dead giveaway to see if they're happy or not. I realize a lot of photographers have a difficult time achieving realistic laughs. And this is why I'm saying I put down my camera and I talk more, because I focus on getting more candid photographs, right? I'll get postings and then I'll make a joke. 9 out of 10 times it's probably a dirty joke, but I still try to make my best to make that person laugh and just get that candid photograph. Because if it's hard for them to fake a smile, you don't have to be a comedian, but just try to find something that you can relate to, something that they're happy about, and that resonates well with them, and try to capture that specific moment. There's no way that you can fake genuine emotion. In studying traditional portraiture, I realized there's two of the most common poses that most photographers stick to, and that's hands at your sides and hands crossed against your chest. Those don't work in every context, right? There's so many other poses that you can wind up using, but inevitably somebody stands in front of the camera and their hands are at their sides. You take a photograph and you're like, "Yay, that looks great." And then they cross their arms and you're like, "Yay, that looks great." What's that saying for body language? What's that communicating? There's so much beyond just crossing your arms. There's so many other poses to use. If you think of, and this is me being blatant again, look at history. Study the greats, steal from the greats. I'm not talking about modern portrait photographers. I'm not talking about myself. I'm talking about your Michelangelos, your Leonardo da Vinci's, all the great artists of all time. If you look at them, they didn't just have their subject with their hand at their sides. They didn't have their subject just crossing their arms. Look at them for inspiration, realize that there's so many other things that you can bring to the table. What a lot of photographers don't realize, even with something like posing arms, right? Crossing arms, for example, this can easily go from defensive, because it's all the way up here and I look like you don't want to talk to me, I want nothing to do with you, to self-loathing, even something so simple as that. And what I do, shift my hands, right? And then confidence, and looking at everybody and looking confident. This communicates something completely different. When I look at you and I have that smile, this looks more confident than this does. Or this, and this looks defensive. Knowing the nuances of difference between those three minor poses makes a big difference when you're trying to photograph somebody and convey a certain message with their specific body language. Hands are by far some of the most crucial things that you need to pose on set, and here's why. If I have my hands open, it means open and honesty. I have nothing to hide, I have no weapons in my hand, inevitably. And I say that because if you think about body language, when I show you my open hands, biologically and historically, it meant that I had nothing to hide like a weapon, right? If I hid my hands behind my back, you're more uneasy, and you're thinking about what could possibly be behind my back. If I have my hands and I put them in my pockets, either I'm cold or I'm shy and reserved. Right? So as I'm posing people, I'm thinking about these things. If I have my thumbs out of my pockets and my hands in my pockets, that conveys a sense of confidence and cockiness, right? Everything that we do in those small nuances of difference communicates something differently with your clients. So don't forget about posing your hands. So one of the things I realized quickly when I'm photographing anybody is a sense of things that we do to make ourselves feel better. Inevitably, a lot of people do this when they're thinking about something or they feel uncomfortable about something, or they do things like this, or they clench their fists. I know when someone feels uncomfortable. I know when you're doing something that makes you feel uncomfortable. Even if I don't mention it, What I'm doing from then on, once I've rationalized that, is diffusing the situation. But knowing those little minor differences is the key role to photographing anybody and knowing what makes them feel uncomfortable. So if I say, this is an amazing shot, and they still look uncomfortable, now I can come back with, you look amazing, I promise you look amazing, until this goes away. That's so important when you're selling anyone on set. Even something so subtle as clench fists. Like when I clench my fists together and I have them to my side, it's a sense of anger and it's a sense of frustration, right? Clench fists isn't something you would necessarily use for certain business professionals, especially if you're working with somebody who's supposed to be open and communicative and discussing things. Don't clench your fists. This doesn't look like that person wants to work with you or do business with you. On a private portrait session, it's the same thing. If you're photographing somebody for, I don't know, dating profiles, you don't necessarily want them with clenched fists. What is that message conveying to their specific audience? That's so important when you're a portrait photographer. So I think a lot of people, when they think about portrait photography, they think of these like traditional hands-on face things. When you're looking at hands-on face, you're thinking about the thinker. You're thinking about somebody who has something on their mind and something that they're thinking about and want to convey. Those subtle nuances of body language mean so much to the audience that most photographers don't realize. They just think of it as a good pose, but why is it a good pose? What's happening in the context of that image? If you're photographing somebody who's supposed to be a thought leader, knowing exactly what this means and knowing that what they're thinking about is so important. That conveys a message to the audience. Maybe you don't want, because they're a thought leader, you don't want somebody who's sitting here crossing their arms. This doesn't convey, I'm actually trying to think about something, more so than I'm being defensive about what's here, or I don't want to do this photo shoot or something that's there. Thinking about things that are happening on set, knowing what that body language is doing. A hidden gem that you guys probably don't know is that the commercial industry uses a lot is pupil size can determine how much interaction you have with your client. Statistically, the opposite sex finds people with larger pupil sizes to be much more attractive and engage with them. People that have narrower pupil size can feel less engaged or less attractive. Now, knowing that allows me to photograph someone to look their best. If I don't want to if I don't want a narrower pupil size on set, I would use a larger, softer form of light versus smaller forms of light. Or even turning down that modeling light allows for much more ambient light to hit in and for their pupil sizes to open. One of the easiest ways to convey comfort is taking up space. When you think of iconic figures like somebody like James Dean, he took as much space as he could. If he sat in a chair, he sprawled out in the chair, right? When he stood in the context of an environment, he took up his environment. Whatever he chose to sit on or lay on or whatever it was, he owned it. The wider you are, it shows how much more comfortable you are in that environment. And I say that because when we're curled up into a tiny ball and I become a recluse, this means that I'm not comfortable in that environment. Versus when you're sitting at home and you're nice and comfortable in your own chair, it conveys a message. These are things that we can think about as photographers when we're trying to convey a message to our audiences. If the eyes are the windows to the soul, and I can tell if somebody's lying or if they're telling the truth, the legs show all their intentions. When someone has their legs pointed in a given direction, it means that that's where they're headed. That's where they want to go. If I have a foot towards that door, you know that my intentions are to go towards that door. If my foot is towards the opposite side, then my intended direction is towards the opposite side. And I think people don't rationalize this as they're taking photographs. If you take a photograph of a male portrait and it happens to be in their office, and that person's feet aren't facing the right direction, you can convey, I'm gonna walk out on you, doing business. If the groom's feet are facing the opposite direction, they don't look engaged, I promise you he looks like he's running away from his wife. These are things that you can think about as a portrait photographer and the importance of knowing even the subtleties of positioning your feet. So during my presentations, I do this a lot. When you see me on stage, I always have a Superman pose going on. I put my hands to my hips. Here's why. Because it conveys confidence. I don't have any fears of what's going on and I feel empowered. Now think about it this way. Psychologically, you're not protecting anything, right? Your chest, your heart, your vital organs, all your private areas, everything is left exposed because you're so confident in yourself that you let everything exposed. I say that because psychologically, we want to protect ourselves when we don't feel comfortable. When someone has a Superman pose, they're showing infinite confidence. They're showing, I was able to resolve that situation doing this, and that's so important. When I'm photographing anyone, mirroring my client allows me to build rapport with that specific person. If you happen to be more comfortable in a chair, I can replicate that so we have a bond with one another. If you look like you have your arms crossed and I mimic that, we now have the same tone. We're speaking the same language. It's the same thing as if somebody sent you a sentence-long email and you send them one back that's like 2 pages long. The communication, there's a breakdown in communication, right? You want to replicate that person's body language in order to create rapport with them. When you're photographing anyone, your angle of view is one of the most important things that you can think about while working on set. Here's why. When I photograph someone from a lower angle, I'm giving them more power in frame. They look larger, I'm shooting them from a lower angle, and therefore they take up the whole frame. They look like they're very confident on set. They're larger than life. When I photograph them from a higher angle lower, I'm now taking away that power. They look smaller in frame. They look less powerful than they do from shooting at a lower angle. Even knowing that your angle of view can change the way that a client and their audience perceives that specific image. Lighting is one of the most important tools that I have as a photographer to work on set. It helps me define cheekbones, define jawlines, making sure that my client feels and looks their best. If they have beautiful eyes, I can draw attention to their eyes. If they have an amazing jawline, I can better define their jawline. Ultimately, lighting helps me either accentuate or detract attention from certain areas that my client may not feel comfortable with. If you're a photographer, you have to understand the properties of light. You have to understand the quality of light, the quantity of light, the color of light, the direction of light. All of those factors play a key role into lighting all your subjects. So here's an example. If you have a subject that's very self-conscious about their weight, you don't necessarily want to use a very flat form of light because ultimately that's going to go ahead and broaden their face. It's going to broaden their image on the camera and they're not going to feel and look their best. Especially because everyone has their nuances of what they find beautiful about themselves. I want to better define them specifically. If somebody has more weight to them, contrast usually helps, making sure that I position my light in areas where I can detract away from let's say double chins. I can use shadows to contour those areas. I don't necessarily want to use broader forms of light. I can use posing to help accentuate those things, but lighting is the most important tool that I have in my skill set to make that happen. My favorite 3 modifiers in set are pretty simple. My first is a Profoto Deep White XL, which is a huge reflective umbrella, and it's one of the softest forms of light that I have. But because of the depth of the reflector, I have a lot of control over where that reflector is being positioned compared to a normal, typical reflective umbrella. The second is a parabolic umbrella. A parabolic umbrella has a lot more depth than my reflective umbrella. I have an inner one-stop diffusion material in my parabolic umbrella behind me. I have an outer which helps me soften the gradation of light. It still has a lot of control, but it's a very soft form of light. Depending on where I position my subject, I can either use them in the fall off of light to better accentuate cheekbones and jawlines, or I can create a very soft form of light by centering them on that specific modifier. My third is pretty simple. It's just an Octabox. I don't really need a lot of lighting products on set. For those of you with different budgets, those are 3 different price points. If you guys can't afford the higher end parabolic softbox, you can just use the Octabox. Everything we're creating today is extremely replicable in your specific area. Reflectors help me control light. Reflectors are the most important tool that you can use on set, especially if you don't have any other modifiers. Invest in a reflector. I specifically either use a white reflector or a silver reflector. I don't typically shoot gold. A lot of my imagery is usually cooler, so I opt to use more silver tones in those images. However, I use a specific silver type of material. I'm using a super soft silver reflector from Rogue products. Now Rogue creates this super soft silver reflector. It's a mixture between a typical silver reflector, and then you have the softness of a white reflector. So you have a lot of control, but a lot of softness with that specific modifier. My favorite 3 lighting patterns are relatively simple, and they're honestly traditional. I love butterfly lighting, which is going to be the most typical. It reminds me of overhead light. Rembrandt light is one of my favorite, or my number 1 favorite as I like to say, because it's very, very painterly. It reminds me of old Renaissance paintings. And my last one is going to be loop lighting, which is just an offset of almost butterfly lighting, but it creates this beautiful, subtle shadow right under the nose that you just don't get anywhere else. With that, I'm going to show you guys how I light things.
For you to get the most out of lighting, you have to understand the core fundamental principles of light. The quantity of light, or the intensity, how intense that light is. The quality of light, or how much contrast there is. The direction of light, or the angle. And the color temperature of light. These 4 fundamental principles of light guide how I light every single one of my subjects in any circumstance. Now, the quantity of light, or how many lights there are on set, or how intense the lights are on set. Usually on set I will have 1 light and a reflector or a couple of reflectors. And this is simply because I can focus and better focus my attention on that 1 light. I'm not thinking about 2, 3, 4, 5 lights on set, the intensity of those lights, the directions of each of those lights, the color temperature of each of those lights. I can better focus my attention on 1. So you'll quickly realize that I use softer forms of light and less power. Now, when I'm using less power or less intense forms of light, that's simply because I'm working in a controlled environment. When I'm in a studio environment, I don't need a ton of light. I can create my own light. I find that oftentimes I can get away with having a 250 watt studio strobe on set and nothing more. While it's convenient to have a 500 watt studio strobe on set to create light on location, I don't necessarily need that in a studio environment. So don't feel like you need to upgrade to a 500 watt set unless you're trying to capture movement. If it's a standard stationary pose, a 250 watt light will just do okay. And there's nothing wrong with working with that amount of power. Now, 1 light isn't always enough. There are times when I'm not going to have enough light under the chin. There's times when I'm not going to have enough light on the opposite side of my subject. And this is when I add a reflector. I don't need a second light on set. Using a V-flat, a white V-flat, or a reflector on set can save you time, energy, and money. If you don't have the budget to go up to 2 lights, using a reflector or a V-flat on set is an invaluable tool and skill set to learn in order to reflect light. Now remember, it's not a source of light, it's reflecting your source of light. So you have to also understand the direction of light, which I'll cover quickly very soon. The second thing to remember is the quality of light. If you notice, I use very soft forms of light, and that's simply because if you're photographing the average Joe, the average person, the average guy, you have to remember that each and every one of us, we're not models. We don't have modelly skin. I say that because we have blemishes and wrinkles and color disfigurations, all these different nuances of difference than what actual models have. Remember that their job is predominantly to look good in front of that camera. So they're taking care of their skin, they're taking care of their wrinkles, they're taking care of all that stuff. Your average portrait client isn't doing that. So don't feel like you need to use harsher forms of light. Remember that when it comes to the quality of light, the one rule to remember is that the smaller your modifier is compared to your subject, the harsher that form of light is going to be. And the larger that modifier is compared to your subject, the softer that light's going to be. And it's a fairly simple form of light. So I tend to use larger forms of light on my subjects because they have real skin, because they have real blemishes. Contrast isn't forgiving when it comes to flaws. Ultimately, softer forms of light allow me to fill in all those unwanted shadows, all those unwanted eye bags and wrinkles and pimples and blemishes, and take them all away before using programs like Photoshop and Capture One to better accentuate those specific features. Opt to use larger modifiers when you're working in the right environment. You'll notice I'm using an octabox. You'll notice that I'm using a parabolic umbrella. Those are very soft forms of light. On top of that, I'm using diffusion material that further softens my form of light. The third thing to remember is your direction of light. I prefer some really fundamental patterns of light. Simply put, my three favorite patterns of light are Rembrandt light, loop light, and butterfly lighting. Rembrandt light occurs when there's a small triangle of light just under the eye. Loop lighting occurs when there's a small loop just under the nose. Butterfly lighting occurs when there's a butterfly shape just under the nose. Now, in order to create those three different patterns of light, you have to understand what the direction and angle is doing. For instance, in order to create loop lighting, there has to be a loop under the nose. But if the loop touches the cheek, creating a small triangle under the eye, now you have Rembrandt light, an old style of painterly, beautiful style of lighting. Butterfly lighting occurs when there's that small butterfly shape just under the nose. That's created by the tip of the nose and the nostrils of the nose, creating that small butterfly shape just under the nose. Now, you can define, or you can better define the shape depending on the modifier that you use. If you want a more defined shape for that butterfly under the nose, then use harsher forms of light. If you want a softer transition between light and shadow, you use softer forms of light. It's a fairly simple process. We go right back to the quality of that light. And finally, we talk about color. When you're working in a studio environment, make sure you're switching your camera over to studio strobe. Make sure that white balance is set to studio strobe so you're getting the right color temperature right in camera as you're photographing your subjects. Make sure you're shooting raw. Make sure you're seeing everything as it should be on the back of your camera, tethering into a laptop, which is my preferable method for seeing everything as it's happening. Our first lighting setup is one of my favorite, and it's also one that I use a lot on fashion and editorial sets. We're going to place our main light above our subject's head and use a reflective umbrella with diffusion to modify our light source. Our light is placed approximately 2 to 3 feet above our subject's head, and because I'm using a fairly large modifier, light will travel in a fairly broad pattern, allowing me to fill in the shadows under my subject's brow. In the event that you opt to use a reflective umbrella without diffusion material, know that you'll have much more contrast than the softness of this specific modifier. If that's the case, I'd advise using a reflector to fill in those shadows. Our second lighting setup is just as simple, and that's to place my main light, which is modified by an octabox, at Rembrandt position. Rembrandt light is achieved when my light is placed 45 degrees to the side of my subject and roughly 2 to 3 feet above their eye level, facing downward. While it's one of the most fundamental lighting setups, it's by far one of my favorite to use with an octabox because depending on the distance of that specific modifier, I can control the spread of light, highlighting key areas that I want to accentuate. Using a smaller octabox, for example, illuminates my subject's face and chest, and then light falls off relatively softly to shadow. When you're using a fairly large modifier, like a 47-inch or 59-inch parabolic softbox, you can create really soft light on your subject from a distance. However, remember this rule. The larger your light source is compared to your subject, the softer the light's going to be. The smaller the light is compared to your subject, the harsher that light's going to be. Because I'm using a really large modifier compared to my subject, I have the ability to create beautiful, soft light. For this specific image, I wanted something that was going to be much more dramatic than the rest of my images, so I opted to use an aperture of f/8 and lowered the power of my main light to be exposed for that specific setting. This allows me to draw all the attention to the key areas of my subject's face, his eyes, nose, and his smile. Our fourth setup is the same as our second, but instead of using an octabox, we're going to use a larger modifier. A large reflective umbrella, specifically the Profoto Umbrella Deep White XL with diffusion. The diameter of this specific modifier is a lot larger than the Octabox, and therefore the light is a lot softer, allowing light to light all of my subject with a beautiful light without the need for a reflector. Because of the size of the modifier, we also have light hitting the background, which also creates separation between our subject and the background. Our last setup is a play off of our first setup, and that's to use an Octabox overhead. Now, because we're using a smaller modifier, we're not going to have as much light, which means that we'll have much more shadows in our image and not as much light separating our subject from the background. However, using this specific modifier better defines our subject's cheekbones and jawline, so in order to fill in some of those shadows, we're going to introduce a reflector underneath our subject's chin. Not only will that reflector help us lighten the shadow areas of our subject, but it'll also allow us to create a beautiful catch light in the eye. In the event you don't see a catch light or your subject's eyes are completely in shadow, you can either angle your light slightly towards your subject or move your subject slightly further towards that background.
I hope that you guys leave this whole production with knowing how to photograph a client in a very confident way. Ultimately, I know by investing in my client's brand, investing in my client's image, that inevitably I'm investing in them, and I have more repeat business that way. A lot of my clients have become friends of mine. I have their numbers on my cell phone. They text me on happy birthdays. They text me happy New Year's. We have conversations. Now, building that rapport allows repeat business. I'm consistently working with them to come up with new projects, and we work hand in hand to make those things happen. When you're a photographer who's doing one-off transactions, you want to make sure that you try to get as many referrals as possible. Building rapport allows me to do that. I think about our job much more than a creative mindset. I think it revolves around a lot of salesmanship, and I hope you guys learned that from watching the series.